I use sometimes I turn. I was empty. I always take it. I don't know, but it's slower. The variance in time is the key thing. So the check is often like 2 hours late. I'm just coming from DC.
Good morning. All right, a call and response audience. Now that's from my culture. I appreciate it. Okay, welcome to everyone on YouTube and on Zoom and here in the Royal Sonesta. My name is Ibanya Washington, and along with Francesco Trebi, I co-direct the NBER program on political economy, and you are here for our day 2 of our Summer Institute. We have a great program, as you've seen if you've already joined us yesterday, so I will try to be super brief. Let me just do the thank yous, which are the most important thing. A thank you first to Connor, our IT person, who has kept this thing running very smoothly, and to the rest of the NBER staff. Thank you to the authors, to the discussants, to the organizers, Stelios Mikalopoulos, Vincent Pons, Enrico Spirale, and Stephanie Stancheva, who will be running the morning program. And I thank you, the audience, for the productive discussion that we always have here. Now, let me review the code of conduct. The NBER does not tolerate discrimination or harassment of any kind. If you encounter such, please report it to any of the NBER staff, to me. If it happens in this room and you don't want to talk to somebody in this room about it, there's Altera Maloney, there's the ombudsperson, there's Jim Paterba. And then finally, let me remind you that we are on YouTube, which means 2 things. One, let's be careful about what we say and know that there's an audience of people that we don't know who may be hearing it. And let's be careful about how we say it. Into the microphone, saying our name first, so that the people that we've invited to join us can actually feel welcome and hear us. Okay, Stephanie.
Great. Welcome back, everybody. Great to see you all early morning here. So as a reminder, we have 25 minutes for the presenters, 15 minutes for the discussants, and then 20 minutes for the audience. I'll be showing you how much time you have left here. So Chenzi, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you all so much for putting us on the program. This is work that's joint with Adrian Moutre, Carsten Mueller, Zekai Shin, and we are motivated by the change in the world economy in the last few years, where internationally there's been an increase in tensions between countries. And domestically, there's been a rise in the use of industrial policy, especially in advanced economies. Now, the most studied tools by economists, at least recently, has been the study of sanctions and tariffs. And in this paper, we're just going to argue that there's actually another widely used tool that's been mostly overlooked, and it's well encapsulated by this New York Times article from earlier this year that's talking about the bank, the Export-Import Bank, that is financing one of Trump's projects to stockpile critical minerals, i.e. a domestic industrial policy program, to reduce reliance on China in response to geopolitical tensions. Okay. So the Exim Bank is the US Export Credit Agency, and export credit agencies generally are government banks that provide financing via loans or loan guarantees and insurance to support foreign purchases of domestic goods and services. And this includes in the US, the Exim Bank, in China, the Exim Bank and Sinosure, BPI France, and Germany's Euler Hermes. But more generally, ECAs operate in about 100 countries. and they operate in countries that have any relevant footprint in international trade. So they operate in countries that account for 92% of the value of global exports. And in fact, they are the most prevalent tool of modern industrial policy. Despite all that, we know quite little about where this money goes and why. And so that's what we're going to do in this paper. We're going to first give you a conceptual sense of what ECA financing does. Okay, so ECA financing broadly is underwriting an exporter by foreign buyer relationship. This example here is from the actual records of the US Exim Bank, where Sun Africa, a US firm, has been contracted to construct photovoltaic solar power plants in Angola. Okay, the amount of this project is just under $1 billion, and Sun Africa is going to provide construction equipment in Angola. Okay. The way this is being financed is via this ECA loan, where the US Exim Bank is directly lending the funds to this US exporter. But the debt obligation rests on the side of the Angolans. And in this particular case, the borrower is a direct sovereign ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Water, who is holding the debt obligation and eventually will have to repay. There are other versions of these sorts of arrangements, perhaps through a loan guarantee or perhaps directly to the solar power plants in Angola. What's important, though, is that at the end of the day, so were any defaults to happen in the Angolan side, it's a sovereign to sovereign obligation. So ultimately, the US government, through its ECA, has a claim on the Angolan government. All right, so because this is kind of a sovereign to sovereign capital flow, what we want to first do is characterize these flows and the allocation of these flows. And the second is to put just a little bit of structure on how governments are allocating capital across these foreign recipients. In order to do that, we put together this new data set, which is the first to actually map this global export credit market. And we see both the overall market over time, as well as, most importantly, the bilateral allocation between lenders and borrowers. And we do this by combining a number of different data sets. But the most important one, as I've emphasized, is that this is really the first time we're able to see at the creditor by recipient level exactly who is lending to whom. So in the first part of the paper, we have two main results. The first is that quantitatively, it's first order, especially for low-income countries who depend on ECA financing for their imports, and it's a large share of their overall capital inflows. Second is that there is a very dramatic shift in the creditor landscape over the last 20 years, where China has emerged as the single largest provider. And then in the third part, we're going to show some evidence that geopolitical considerations are shaping this bilateral allocation. Right. Okay, so let me show you the data. The first thing is that there is data collected on ECA flows. The main provider of that data is the OECD. However, the OECD was able to obtain this reporting from different ECAs by promising that it would not release the bilateral identities, because ECAs, in fact, are quite secretive about what they're doing, and we've approached many, and most are like, no, go away. So what we see from the OECD is take a given lender country, for instance, Germany. We know that the underlying flows to sub-Saharan Africa are to Nigeria, Kenya, Angola. But we don't know what those exact amounts are. We only see a flow from Germany to sub-Saharan Africa. And it's true on the other way around as well. We'll see how much Nigeria receives, but only from North America or Northern Europe, for instance. What we figured out is that actually the OECD reports the bilateral totals and the bilateral components in two different systems. These are parallel systems that then allow us to just use an accounting identity. So the total flows include aid, other flows that exclude export credits, and what we're interested in, which is export credits. So we have that at the bilateral level every year. There's also the microdata that accompanies these overall total flows, which separates out aid and other flows. And so actually we can recover the bilateral flows of export credits. And it turns out that doing this works pretty well compared to the aggregates that they report, both at the creditor group level as well as at the recipient group level. So we use that to construct the large majority of our bilateral flows. But then we also have this amazing data source called aid data that gives us key bilateral lending by major non-OECD creditors, primarily China and India, and that we can see at the loan level. So ultimately, we have this coverage bilaterally between countries every year from 1960 to 2024. We complement this data with a data set on the aggregate global export credit exposure data set, which actually includes both publicly provided export credits from ECAs as well as privately provided credit from private banks. In this data set, it is not always possible to distinguish what is publicly provided versus privately provided, but we can always distinguish the maturities. And so here, medium and long term, which I've colored in green just to make it click with ECAs, is almost entirely ECA finance. So that is 90% of that market is ECA finance. And so when we show pictures showing the different maturities, the green are roughly what's ECA finance. All right, so now to the first part of the paper where we're going to size this market. Overall, this is a time series of both the private and public allocations of trade finance outstanding. These are exposures at the end of the year, okay, measured in US trillions. And as you can see, medium and long term is roughly about a third, but if you allow for the third that's coming from ECAs in the short term, then about half of global trade finance is coming from these government agencies. We're going to benchmark that against world trade flows, and we do that by making some assumptions about the average maturity of a short-term loan versus a medium and long-term loan. And if we do that, then over this time series, these dollars of financing are backing approximately 40% of the value of international trade. All right. So now let me get into the components of these macro data. Our first fact is that ECAs finance a large share of developing country imports. So we've divided countries into different income groups, lowest income at the top, highest income at the bottom. Overall, there's a pretty clear pattern that as you go up the income spectrum, the share of trade financing necessary for your imports goes down. And that's in part because firms themselves are able to finance firm-to-firm trade more. But in addition, within these income brackets, the the ECA share within the low income is much higher than the ECA share within the high income. On average, it's about 15% of imports for the low-income countries. And if we look at the country-by-country dispersion, so here I'm showing you the top 20 most dependent countries, then it is precisely countries that have less developed financial markets, that perhaps have less exposure to international markets overall, that are depending on this sort of financing. Another way to benchmark these numbers is relative to cross-border lending. And here we're using the dollars of foreign exposure coming from other sorts of loans. And the contrast is even more stark when we think about the low income versus the high income contrast. And again, if we look at the actual countries, the difference is very clear. Countries like South Sudan, North Korea, Guinea-Bissau are not countries that are able to issue debt on international financial markets. They don't have banks internationally lending to them, nor do they have access to corporate debt markets, nor do they have really access to sovereign debt markets. And so for a number of these countries, this is the key way in which they are receiving foreign capital inflows. All right. The third fact is that in the last 20 years, China is by far the largest in absolute terms. So over $800 billion relative to the next closest country, which is Germany, at just under 400. The countries in blue here are members of an institution called the OECD arrangement, and that's going to be what my last result is about. And the ones in red are these non-OECD members. Now, China, of course, is also a very large exporter. So a very natural way to benchmark this is relative to the dollars of their exports. And here, China is also the largest financer, shortly followed by India and bizarrely enough, Finland, and Brazil. So the BRICS countries are really leaning heavily into these institutions. In the time series, we can look at all of the lending at the medium long term. So we're sure that this is coming from ECAs from 1970 onward. These are the OECD countries. In the 1980s, there was roughly twice as much relative to the 2000s. If we add India to this map, even though it's financing a large share of its own exports, it's really not making much of a difference in the global aggregates. But China is completely different. So the sheer size of China means that in the 2010s, and especially, it had more financing than all OECD countries combined. Now, what is China doing with that money? Well, the allocation looks fairly different. So here, every bar is splitting the total dollars of financing a country receives between China in red and all other OECD countries in blue. And so the country recipients that have the largest Chinese shares of financing are Iran, Russia, Pakistan, Belarus. These are countries that, as we all know, have not had the best of relations with Western countries in the last 20 years. Okay. More generally, if we look at all the countries and the way they're the relative shares, there's many ways in which we can split how much, a given origin creditor country is financing to a destination recipient country. The correlation between China and the West is very low overall. Okay. So with those facts, I just want to give some recap in the way we interpret this data. So for trade flows, trade financing is critical for many developing economies, especially when they're for transactions that are large and capital intensive, indicating that trade patterns are at least partially shaped by this policy-driven credit allocation. In terms of cross-border financing, a large share of external debt from low-income countries is coming from these same institutions that's creating creditor exposure comparable to that of sovereign lending, again, for some of these countries that are the least integrated in the international economy. And so trade financing is a tool that creates access to foreign capital markets and financial leverage. And then in recent years, we see this massive use of this tool by China, which all points to a role for these credits that may go beyond just economic interests. All right. So in the last part of the paper, we're going to present two results about how to think about these export credits. And we have a very simple allocation framework. It's so simple that it's not worth calling it a framework, but there's an equation, so hence a framework. What we have is that S is a vector of allocations that a origin country is choosing to allocate, and it cares about the green term, the domestic economic return. It cares potentially about this red term, the geopolitical value of a given relationship with a foreign country. And this is all subject to international constraints. So we actually have a completely separate paper that is all about the domestic economic return. And the punchline of that paper is the return is highest when the transactions are actually targeting true financing frictions. That's on my website, should you want to read another paper. Today, we're going to focus on the geopolitical value, so strategic incentives to finance one country vis-a-vis another. and international constraints, the most relevant of which is the OECD arrangement, which are explicit rules that govern how credit should be allocated, how it should be priced, and to assure that it's not priced sort of below market risk. Okay, so let me start with the geopolitical value. For this, we take the methodology from the aid literature, where we look at the temporary election of countries onto the UN Security Council, of which there are 5 permanent members and 10 rotating members. And we have prior evidence that, when a country is on the Security Council and its votes matter for relatively important measures, it seems that the permanent members do allocate more aid to those countries. So we're just going to ask the exact same question in the context of export credits. And we do that by estimating this triple diff, where we have a permanent member lender to a elected member country in the years around the country's election. And very importantly, we're going to include this variable, this trade OD ET term, which is the predicted values of trade between those two countries in any given year that we're predicting from an estimated gravity regression. So just the natural extent to which countries might be economically integrated. That allows us to interpret these betas as the financing that's sort of in excess of the fundamental amounts of trade between these two countries. We have creditor-recipient election fixed effects. Okay, so now we have all the bilateral characteristics around two countries in those years fixed. And we have election year fixed effects to help address differences in staggered treatment. So our interpretation is that, UNSC membership is a relatively temporary and perhaps modest increase in a country's leverage. And so we think this is perhaps a lower bound on the importance of these considerations. And so what we find is that precisely in the years that a country is elected, it is receiving more financing from the permanent members relative to the years before, and it immediately reverses right after it's off the Security Council. And this is robust, including a number of additional fixed effects. So that's our first set of results, which indicates that, at least in this evidence, export credits are used to compete for geopolitical influence. Now, in the second part, we want to think more about these multilateral institutions whose objective is actually to constrain the use of strategic allocation. And here we point to the OECD arrangement, which dates from 1978, which was explicitly created to prevent subsidized trade terms that would be a way to get around WTO rules about trade subsidies. The way this works is that the OECD creates this country risk assessment model that sets minimum risk premia for ECA financing, and it assigns risk scores to recipient countries. The idea is just that we should be pricing the risk premium correctly. What's kind of interesting is that this is a completely voluntary arrangement. It is also it has no enforcement mechanisms, and the largest lenders in this market are not part of this arrangement. Okay, so it is purely a gentleman's agreement. That being said, the CRAM model is very, very complete, and it gives a clear view into how people think these should be priced. Okay, but roughly speaking, the way we're going to think about this is that if this arrangement is effective, then an increase in a country's risk score is going to imply a higher risk premium and, all else equal, lower ECA volumes. And so that's precisely what we ask. We look at the change in financing to a destination country that has had a change in their risk score in a given year. Again, we're going to control for the real predicted flows of trade, as well as other pair fixed effects. And we see that on average, when risk scores goes up, allocation goes down. But there's a big difference between countries. Okay, so here we separate recipient countries into those that are what we call non-aligned and those that are aligned. we use the UN General Assembly voting for separating non-aligned and aligned pairs. What's really cool is that recently in geoeconomics, lots of people have come up with new scores, and so that's something that we hope to use in the future. But here, what we see, at least using this particular measure, is that the brunt of the response is coming in reducing your allocation to non-aligned countries, whereas for aligned countries, the fact that your credit risk score has changed does not appear to be changing your relative price. Okay, all right. So just to recap, we're arguing that export credits are a major, often overlooked instrument of modern industrial policy, geoeconomic competition. We have new data. We show that export credits are quantitatively important, and we show some evidence that geopolitics seems to play a role in the global allocation. In terms of how we think about this, I do think that this indicates that the current policy debate is a bit incomplete because tariffs and sanctions are just one of many tools, and this particular one is widely used and incredibly opaque relative to those other tools. And so I don't think we can fully understand this geopolitical landscape without thinking about who finances international trade. And the implications for developing countries are particularly large because, as we've noted, they're the least integrated into the international economy, and they have the least outside options for accessing international goods and international capital. Okay, thank you so much.
Our discussant is Jeffrey Frieden. You have an extra minute that we just didn't use.
Got the clicker. Good. Okay, that didn't work. Someone hit something. It's on now? Okay, good. Good. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss this. It's a really interesting paper. It's the data collection alone is a fantastic contribution. And as you've seen, the descriptive statistics, I learned so much from the descriptive statistics. You should look at it. It'll change your mind about what exactly export credits are and the role that they play. The analysis is very careful. I do have to say that Chenzi didn't even mention what I took to be the main part of the paper, which is what I'm going to mostly talk about. And so I guess I have to describe that a little bit. And that is that the export credits are affected by geopolitical alignments. They use that General Assembly voting and look at the allocation. And what they find is that the West lends very widely. And there's a slight tendency actually to lend to countries that are less aligned with the US. So that's different than the Security Council finding. That's the General Assembly voting finding. China lends a lot of money to countries that are less aligned, probably for resource and strategic reasons. But that both of them increase the lending to countries as alignment increases. The US has become more explicitly geopolitical, especially with regard to China. And of course, China has become increasingly important in this space. So let me this, by the way, showing the US. This is actually the program under which the US lent that Angolan money. It's a specific China program saying, if you are doing something in competition with China, we'll give you a lot of money. So that's how they got the money for the Angolan solar panel project. So I have three sets of questions. The first is, what do we mean by export credits? The second is, what do we mean by industrial policy? And the third is, what do we mean by geopolitics? And I'm not really trying to be pedantic, but I guess what that shows is that I can be pedantic even without really trying. And this is not really definitional. It's more thinking about how do we categorize, measure, and analyze the categories that we're talking about. So the export credits in question, as you've heard, is only the medium term ones. That is the ones that we're focusing on, which they're almost exclusively public. They're about 25% of global export credits, of global trade finance. And they may not have been clear, but most of them are provided by private financial institutions. There's a lot of government money involved, but it's mostly private financial institutions that get a guarantee or insurance from the Export Credit Agency. They're publicly insured or guaranteed. And, mostly from the OECD up until around 2000, then China comes on side. Now, no question, as they say, they can be political. They're being given by national governments that have goals that are both economic and diplomatic and military. But again, the private lenders and exporters are also taking politics and geopolitics into account, I think. So we want to think about the extent to which there are private decisions being made. So the private lender, the private exporter has to say, do I want to go to Exim Bank and get insurance for this? So there's a decision being made on the private side that is not really geopolitics, and that might respond to political unrest, coups, expropriations. In fact, they say it's at some point that, or in the appendix, it's noted that 2/3 of the lending done by the German Export Credit Agency is actually done for the reason of a private agent trying to protect against things like political instability, coups, expropriation. So that, in my mind, is not geopolitics. It's affected by geopolitics, but that's not government-to-government geopolitics. That's a private decision that's being affected by the underlying political environment, right? Okay, so that's export credits. Just to be clear, and I think it's important to try to separate out what is a private decision from what is a government decision that is influenced by geopolitical realities. So, are they industrial policy? Well, in my mind, industrial policies are policies that try to change the economic structure of a society. Everything does that, but I think of the industrial policy as being particularly sectoral, and picking winners, as we used to say, and picking winners and losers, as we used to say before industrial policy was trendy. So I think we want to know, what would export credits, if they were an industrial policy, what would they look like? That is, what would export credits as industrial policy be if there were no geopolitics involved, right? Would it be about general export promotion? Would it be about industrial targeting? Would it be about opening up new markets? Would it be favoring particular industries? I think all of those are important. All of those could be confounds with geopolitics. So again, we want to try to strip away, it's the old lie, you strip away everything that's not geopolitics so that we can analyze the explicitly geopolitical component of the relationship, right? So then, what is geopolitics after all? Again, to reiterate, I don't think we're all that interested in purely private consideration of underlying geopolitical conditions. Private actors are thinking about geopolitics all the time. Is my country allied with the country in question? If I get into trouble, will my home country protect me? Is there going to be a coup in this country? Is there going to be a war in this country? It seems to me that I think we understand that purely commercial lending is always affected by geopolitics, but I think what we really want to know is, to what extent are governments using export credits to pursue military and diplomatic goals? And I think that's conceptually important. And then there's a measurement issue as to how we do this. And here's where I am going to depart from Chenzi, because I'm going to focus on the part of the paper that played the biggest role in the paper and that didn't even appear in her presentation. Okay, so not all politics is geopolitics. Just saying, when the Europeans retaliate against the U.S., they retaliate, they impose barriers to trade on things like Kentucky bourbon and Florida orange juice. That's politics. That's not geopolitics. And virtually any country is going to try to incorporate domestic politics into their calculations, and so are firms. So that's politics, but it's not really geopolitics. To me, the geopolitics of interest, what I think of, is military, diplomatic, strategic alliances and cooperation that are going to have a role in a country's ability to deal with international geopolitical threats. Now, this is where I might have to take a little bit of a detour and explain what they do in the paper. They use General Assembly voting primarily. Well, first, let me say this is the part that Chenzi did cover. They look at Security Council votes in this as this way of saying, well, if you're on the Security Council as a temporary member, you're suddenly more important. Do you get more money? And you do, right? But I want to point something out that interestingly, for the Security Council issue, all the major powers care about is your vote. They don't care about whether you're an ally, whether you're ideologically aligned. It's really just vote buying. The UN General Assembly stuff, which you and your colleagues use, Chenzi and her colleagues use for the paper, is about the alignment of the country. Is the country aligned with the West? Is it aligned with China? Is it aligned with Russia? Things like that. So in the case of the UNGA, the General Assembly voting, we don't really care about the votes. The votes are a proxy for geopolitical alignment. right? What we care about is the alignment, not the votes themselves. So the Security Council and the General Assembly things really are very different and are used for different purposes. But what they show is that, as I said before, that the West tends strikingly there's a slight tendency for Western export credit agencies to lend to countries that are not geopolitically aligned with it, right? Although as countries become more geopolitically aligned, they lend more. And China also lends to countries that are not geopolitically aligned with it. And again, as they become more geopolitically aligned. So having explained what's in the paper, let me say why I have a little bit of a problem with it, because I'm not sure this captures what we want when we're talking about alignment, geopolitical alignment. And here's why. These are the ideal points. This is the ideal point estimates of United Nations General Assembly voting. On the right is the US with the developed countries in the OECD in orange. Blue is developing countries. And as you can see, this is basically a north-south divide. Right. The first dimension is that. The second dimension, if you're interested, is actually Israel-Palestine, which we always typically just remove because it's theater and there are tons and tons of Israel-Palestine votes. So as you can see, this really is a north-south division. I would say it's not really geopolitical, it's more ideological. Right. And it's really something that goes back to the 1970s with the new international economic order. And just to give you an example, Russia and China are right in the middle of that blue cluster. Russia and China are around minus 1.3, 1.4. So they're center left within that developing country block. So that's the actual meaning of those General Assembly votes. Now, is that what we want to focus on? Well, let me give you an example. This is the ideal point distance from the United States. That is how unaligned countries are. Turkey, the Emirates, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The blue dot is the full sample, and then the red triangle is removing Israel-Palestine. So they are very far away. They're about as far away as Russia and China from the United States, right? But is that realistic, and is that really what we're interested in? All four of these countries are very important strategic allies of the US. Turkey is a NATO member. Saudi Arabia has an encompassing and long-term strategic defense agreement. The UAE has something very similar. Egypt is formally recognized by NATO as a major non-NATO ally, although it also has ties to China. All of these are measured as much closer to American adversaries, Western adversaries, China and Russia, than to the US. So are they really geopolitically distant from the US? I would say no. And so it seems to me that we really should not be using these General Assembly measures as an indicator. It's an indicator of ideological alignment in the General Assembly and maybe more broadly, but it's not an indicator of geopolitical alignment. And I think it would be, although it's maybe trivial to point out, more useful to use things like, are you a military ally? Do you have an actual treaty, a common defense treaty, a security treaty? Are you receiving military aid? We don't give military aid to countries that aren't geopolitically aligned with us. We don't give military aid to Iran, right? Or even to Angola. We give them solar panels, but not military aid. So it would be relatively simple to simply say these are geopolitical allies of the US and see what comes there. So that's my main suggestion on the geopolitical front. This is just going in the same direction. These are the top recipients of export credits from the West and from China. And again, many of them are very close geopolitical allies. Turkey, Mexico, Egypt is before, and you can see the top four in China. And the rest are countries that are in play, which I think is also really important. I mean, I think there are two sets of goals here that countries have. You reward your friends, your geopolitical friends, not your ideological friends, and you go after the countries that are swing voters or swing, whatever you want to call them, in play. And they do that. I think that's, if you just look at the numbers and the countries, you see that's what is going on here. But it doesn't correlate well. In fact, it doesn't correlate at all with General Assembly voting. And it doesn't really have much to do with what happens on the Security Council, which is really just vote buying. So when I look at the evidence that they bring to bear, the conclusion that I draw, or not conclusion, but the suggestions that I would draw, or the ideas that come out of it, is, first of all, just methodologically or whatever, I distinguish between ideology, which essentially all the developing countries, almost all the developing countries in the UN have the same very similar sort of global South kind of ideology, and military and geopolitical alliance. And what I took away from the evidence that Chenzi and her co-authors present is that Western governments give favorable treatment to geopolitically important allies, even if they're ideologically very far from Western positions. I mean, countries like Egypt and to a certain extent Turkey and certainly Saudi Arabia are quite far from the West ideologically, but they get a lot of money because they're geopolitically important. They also do reward governments as they move closer to the West ideologically. The Chinese government similarly gives favorable treatment to its geopolitical allies and also to countries that are important for natural resources or their strategic location in the world, again, with very little regard for ideology. And they too then reward governments that move closer to Chinese ideological positions. So that's the conclusion that I draw, the preliminary conclusion that I draw from the evidence that they give, that they present. So export credits are both economically important and politically important. They're powerfully affected by the non-economic goals of the creditor governments. There's no question about that. And those goals include geopolitics, broadly understood. But I would urge us to have a more accurate, I guess, or detailed understanding of what geopolitics means. I don't think ideological alignment, which is what's used very commonly in this literature, is telling us much about geopolitics. It's telling us about, rhetoric in many cases, and also ideology, but things that aren't closely related to geopolitics. That in itself is sort of an interesting question. Is there any sense in which the ideology of a government plays a role in a strategic position in global alliances? That's a question, I think, to be discussed. The role of things like military bases, military alliances, military assistance, that's the core of geopolitics in a diplomatic sense. There's another core of geopolitics, which is especially important, I think, for China, but also for the West, and that is access to natural resources and strategic location, which explains countries like Angola being important, even though from a geopolitical standpoint or a military standpoint, it's not that important. So I think to really understand what's going on, both in the financial world with geopolitics and more broadly with geopolitics, we want to focus on what actually matters to governments as they think about the geopolitical constellation of forces, which really is military and strategic and has very little to do with ideology. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, opening it up for questions.
Owen McGurk Tufts, thank you for a very interesting talk. So I guess we could think about these export credits as being one tool in the geoeconomic toolkit and like very much on the side of rewards rather than punishments. And it wouldn't be the only one in there, right? The other one would be foreign aid or development aid. So it'd be really interesting to know what the relationship is between those two things. Like, are they substitutes or complements? Are export credits more palatable to a domestic political audience than development aid? Or maybe that's the case for some countries and not other countries. I feel like there's probably something we can learn about aid flows from your very cool work. Time's up.
Good idea. My question is also about the economic toolkit. If we think about sanctions and tariffs, both of them are a bit more coalition-based. So to what degree do you think of this as something that can maybe certain level of more coalition-based thing? So again, I guess the substitute thing. And then to Jeff's point about if there are private outcomes involved, to what degree is this undermining maybe other coalition-based things intended or not? And a minor quibble with maybe one statement which is about whether this is a lower bound, what we're measuring is a lower bound, which is whether if it is more of a one-off undermining one thing, then what you're measuring is a one-off tool capturing a one-off goal, and maybe it's not.
There's a much super interesting flavor.
I don't think it's our. Yes. Yeah.
It's okay. I would like to understand also how stable these flows are when there are this rising polarization and changes of government. So for instance, like overnight when the US government changed with the new election. There's been a drastic reduction of flows in countries that are geopolitical allies, such as Jordan, that saw a reduction of PIL of around 1 to 3%. So it would be interesting to see how stable they are to these changes in government.
Yeah, so Sultan from the New Economic School. Okay.
Okay. All right, Ernesto Dalbo. So thank you for the talk of the year. So when I talk to friends who do trade or read trade, and then go to talk to friends that do trade policy making or work in government, it's like I'm looking at two very different realities. And so this paper helps us bridge the things we see in the books and the things we see in the newspapers. So I'm grateful for that. It helps me. But I would love to know a bit more about the details of how this works, maybe centering at the level of the transaction. So it's one thing, as you know, Jeffrey was describing it, if there's some financial friction and then maybe the private party decides, oh, they need insurance and maybe there's a government that can help with that, versus a situation in which there are transactions that are very, very far from being in the radar. And it takes a sort of agreement between governments to unlock something that then you see in the newspapers. And that is very obviously a governmental decision where the private parties are auxiliaries. So that's one aspect that would be helpful to have more context on. The second thing is, I think it is a very good meeting to be discussing this in connection to Jeffrey's comment on what the actual patterns of vote buying are. So we know in basic models of vote buying from Snyder 91 that the patterns of targeting are not always obvious. It's not necessarily that we expect the money to go to the aligned or the non-aligned. There can be various patterns that will obtain. And so it would be helpful to bring in the political economy of vote buying, that it may be helpful here.
Hi, Sultan. I just wanted to, first of all, really great paper. And also, I think more needs to be done on to understand geopolitics and its determinants. So great that you are doing it. I was just wondering, and following up on Jeffrey's point, that can you maybe exploit the fact that like you have in your data, you have this fall of the Soviet Union, and then you have 9/11 attacks, war on terror, alignment. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, which started when China kind of joined many people. So maybe there is a way to show that your measure of geopolitics is correlated with all these stuff, like foreign aid, military bases in your country. And that might kind of help you kind of justify why this is indeed geopolitics. Thanks.
Hi, Enrico Spolore. This is a great, very, I think, important, useful paper to bring in this variable. And also, I think it might allow you to do something that now is very hot in geoeconomics, that is try to recover sort of the more strategic general equilibrium relationship among these people, sort of the network, the interaction, because you have all this bilateral, and you can imagine that you already in your narrative, there's this story, oh, if China does that, then the United States does that. So there is China, Angola, the United States, so there's a triangle. So this is also connected to what Jeff says, that they are forming alliances and coalition, and sometimes you form alliance with people that are very different from you because you have common interests against a common enemy and so on. So I think that, I mean, maybe not in this paper, which has already a lot, but as a next step, I think it would be very, very, very useful to contribute with this variable to the ongoing discussion about networks and interactions among players.
John Barrios. So I think you use it in your other paper. A lot of these kind of credits are for like aircraft, and potentially there's also this component of a domestic like subsidy for exporters. And could you try to kind of exploit that? Maybe it's a separate paper, but even the domestic political interactions, because even I think the point for the Angola was the competition with China. That seems to be kind of the excuse that they brought back the support for Boeing, who had lost a lot of these contracts because of the credits, like you show in your paper of the crowding out. So I thought that would have been nice to kind of see here, if you kind of even maybe control for how much of it is airlines exposure. And I know it's harder to do in the data, but that maybe might increase the power of some of the more geopolitical stuff.
Okay. Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff, for your discussion, and thank you for all your questions. So I think maybe going back to some of these questions, a lot of questions are about how these export credit agencies work. And I hate to be annoying, but we really do that in our other paper. And so broadly, we're very, we really also wanted to understand that. And Jeff is absolutely right. There is a private market component to this, which is that the mandate of these ECAs is to provide financing when the private companies cannot or will not do so. And generally, this is because these transactions are just too risky. And what I mean by that is, in the case of default, there is just no way that Bank of America can go to Madagascar and recoup their losses. Whereas if, the Madagascar company defaults and it's an obligation of the US government, it's actually it is a sovereign obligation. So one large element of this is to provide financial instruments, insurance, and financing when risk or the lack of private financial markets makes it so that there are real credit constraints. So that is for sure one component of it. And what we were trying to do in this paper is to say, well, based on the patterns and based on, for example, what Jeff pulled up, the CTEP program, where the US is explicitly like, hey, is China on your back? Let us help you. That told us that it's not just about these, credit risks. And so, so we do think, there are some transactions where that's clearly going to be interacting. There are others where, like Ernesto, you said, you should think of it as strategic cooperation between two countries. Okay. More generally, I completely agree that the UNGA measure is a very bizarre one, and thank you for your suggestion to look at real treaties or military alliances. As I alluded to in the presentation, there's also some really cool recent work using real-time news to measure just exactly what the tension is between two countries. And we are very excited to use that. But more generally, we did try to move away from focusing on the correlations of alignment and aid, in ECA financing in this paper, and focus more on these experiments. So the two experiments of what happens when you're on the UNSC, which again, as Jeff emphasized, that has nothing to do with the General Assembly. That's just whether you're voting on the Security Council, it's buying votes. And then the OECD agreement is where there's an, plausibly exogenous change to a country's risk measure. And here we do split countries by being aligned versus unaligned. And totally agree, there are better ways to do that. Okay. We too would love to know how this interacts with foreign aid. It's on the to-do list. Thank you for asking about that. I also, Matthias, to your question, do think that a particularly cool element of ECA financing is that it can be so targeted, right? It is at the firm, industry, particular time level. You can use it as a kind of this precision tool for domestic industrial policy, as well as for whatever foreign relations you want to build. So again, going back to Angola, we don't give them military aid, but we may want to finance their solar panels, right? And in that sense, it is a much more flexible tool. And that's also something that we kind of model a bit in our first paper of the ways in which it's actually easier to use without generating so much perhaps dead weight loss. And then, yes, aircrafts are a thing, and they kind of we treat them very seriously again in our prior paper, and they just don't matter that much. Yeah. I apologize if I didn't get to everyone, but yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So we have a break and we reconvene at 10:15.
Thank you.
Runner-up.
Okay, let's get started again.
Oh, yes. I mean, the clicker, sorry. The clicker, yeah. It's gonna set it up 1 second.
Great, so we're delighted to hear right now from Ernesto about immigration and the political behavior of immigrant background Americans.
Good morning. I'm Ernesto Tiburcio. I'm a postdoc at UC Berkeley. Thank you very much to the organizers for the opportunity to present this paper, this joint work with Vicky Fuca and Marco Tabellini, who's here in the audience with us. So immigrant background voters represent a growing share of the electorate in different countries. In the US, the naturalized and second generation immigrants, meaning the children of immigrants, were around 20% of eligible voters in 2024. That's 50 million people. And this share was 15% in 2000. So we've seen a 5 percentage point increase. And the numbers for the European Union are rather similar. So despite their relevance and their importance, we know little about the voting behavior of immigrant background voters. But we know we have suggestive evidence that they lean democratic, but they have recently shifted rightwards. We have evidence that is based on surveys and aggregate evidence at the neighborhood level or grouping immigrant background voters with other groups, but we don't really know whether this evidence mirrors voting behavior, and we don't really know if there has been a shift and how large has the shift been. There's also been accounts that the preferences that immigrant background voters have over recent immigration have been behind this rightward shift. Again, we know little about this. We don't know whether this shift has been really due to immigration or due to something else. And the theoretical prediction about the reaction that established migrants may have about newer migrants is ambiguous. On the one hand, since they have this shared experience, they might be more empathetic towards them. But on the other hand, they might compete with them in the labor market. They might want to distance themselves from newcomers because newcomers face discrimination. So in this paper, we answer these two questions. First, we track the political behavior of naturalized and second-generation Americans using the voter file. Here we rely on birthplace to identify foreign-born voters and their children in 3 states, California, Nebraska, and North Carolina. And we observe the party identification of these voters. Our main finding here is that there's been an increase of Republican registration between 2014 and 2024. This is the period that we study. This increase has been of 3 percentage points for the naturalized, around 1 percentage point for second-generation Americans. This is from a baseline of around 20% of voters in this group who identified as Republicans in 2014. And then we explore the role that immigration ways have had in this political behavior. We predict unauthorized Mexican migration at the county level using initial U.S. county Mexico municipality networks, and we rely on Mexican municipality exogenous push factors. What we find is that immigration inflows boost the Republican registration among immigrant background voters relative to US-born white voters who are our baseline group. The effects that we observe are around one standard deviation in the increase of inflows corresponds to around 0.21 percentage points and 0.3 percentage points, which compares to the mean relative gains of these groups year by year, which are around 2%. Then we explore mechanisms. These are very suggestive evidence, and we do not find suggestive evidence in favor of economic competition, but rather evidence in favor of social distancing, ethnic discrimination, and so on, and the role of immigration policy. We contribute to different literatures, but I want to focus on the first one. We contribute to the literature to studies of the political behavior of immigrants. We are the first, to our knowledge, to estimate effects on political behavior at the person level, as opposed to ecological inferences or survey data, And on the political economy of immigration, there's a large literature on the reactions that countries have to the arrival of newcomers. We identify the differential response, focusing on older established migrants. So the cornerstone of our analysis is the L2 voter file. Elections in the US are organized by states. State governments collect and release information of voters after electoral cycles. Some of the information that they collect are name, age, address, party registration, and turnout. And there's companies called vendors who systematize this information and augment it with model data such as ethnicity, income, education. We use 3 variables primarily to identify these immigrant background voters. The first one, as I said, is the place of birth. Only 3 states in the US consistently record place of birth for most voters. So we rely primarily on that information. Then we use race and ethnicity to identify for some analysis between Hispanic voters and non-Hispanic voters. And we use age and address to identify parental relationships that we use to construct or identify the second generation. So we have 4 main groups in our analysis. The first one is the naturalized. These are just foreign-born, and we use place of birth to identify these voters. Then we have the second generation, which are the children of foreign-born people. This is an underestimate of the true number because we require people to be registered in the same place as their foreign-born registered voter parents. So it's an underestimate. And we use place of birth and the parental relationship that we construct. Then we have US-born whites. These are US-born with European or Anglo ethnicity. So we use place of birth and ethnicity. And the third group, the fourth group that we don't use much is US-born with non-European and Anglo ethnicity. Importantly, our estimates correlate strongly at the county level with census population counts and ACS estimates. So we think we're capturing the population that we intend to study. The final data set that we have has around 100 million observations with 18.5 million voters, 3 million of which are immigrant background voters. In terms of party registration, we collapse all the potential values into 3: Democrat, Republican, or Independent, and other. I want to stop a second here and say that party registration to us is a measure of political behavior, unlike survey data. First, because this is public information, as you know, we've been using this data, so we know the party identification of voters. And then because this allows people to do certain things by being identified with a certain party, such as participating in primaries. So we think this is a key distinction between survey opinions and party registration. This is, we think, an underestimation of voting behavior. Changing parties is a more durable commitment than voting in a certain way. To give you a sense of how this correlates with voting behavior at the county level, a 1% increase in Republican registration is associated with a 2% increase in Republican votes at the county level. So we think we're capturing half of the rightward shift that I'm going to present in a bit. On average, around 4% of people switch parties between elections. Slightly over 2% change to Republican, for example, during our period. So this is the evolution of partisan Republican identification for these 4 groups. We see, probably consistent with priors, that US-born whites have around 37% of voters who identify as Republicans. It has been rather consistent throughout our period, but we see an increase, especially for the naturalized. They started around 20% of them being identifying themselves as Republicans, and then increasing to around 23%, 22% in 2024. I think this is going to be clear if we do this means relative to 2014. We see a decline that reaches its lowest level in 2018, which was a year in which Democrats had a very good election, and then increases consistently until in 2024 it surpasses the share for the naturalized they had in 2014. So we tried to explore some of the correlates of this rightward shift? Is it because immigrant background voters live in certain places? Is it because they have certain characteristics? Is it because maybe they represent a different, they're a moving sample, and sometimes they come in and out of the data? So we address these questions in this descriptive analysis. First, we include county fixed effects and see if this could explain some of the behavior that we observe, and know the pattern is quite consistent. Then we account for demographics. We include age, gender, and income, and we see that the pattern is consistent. Then we include person fixed effects to see if there is something about changing in the sample, and the effects are even larger. And then finally, we restrict the sample to voters that we observe at least in 5 of the 6 elections that we study. And we see that compared to 2014, and in 2024, the naturalized were 3.5 percentage points more likely to be registered Republicans, which is way more than 2 percentage point more than the second generation US-born others and US-born white. And then we study the role of unauthorized Mexican migration, in particular inflows of unauthorized Mexican migration. Mexico remains the largest country for the unauthorized population in the US, both in terms of stocks. Around 40% of unauthorized residents in this country are from Mexico, and also in terms of inflows. 17% of newcomers in the 3 states that we study, in the period that we study, come from Mexico. And we rely on local estimates of unauthorized inflows using the Matrículas Consulares dataset, relying on work that I've done in the past. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, the Mexican state offers through the Mexican consular networks IDs to people living in the US, and these are mainly demanded by people who cannot obtain an ID from a state in the US from an official source. So the assumption is that these are useful primarily for unauthorized migrants. And they indeed capture likely unauthorized migrants. They correlate well with estimates from other sources. The data set that we have has information on the US county of residence and the Mexican municipality of origin, which allows us to construct these networks. We have individual level data from 2002 until 2020, and municipal level data from 2021 to 2024. So we identified the effect of inflows of unauthorized Mexican migration using this regression. I'm not going to go over all the terms, but let me highlight 3 of them. First, we're interested in the effect of these inflows. These are denoted by C, which is the unauthorized migrant as share of county population, predicted and recenter. I'm going to explain this in a second. This is a person-level regression with only consistent voters. Again, those who are in the data set for 5 of the 6 elections that we study at least. And we control for county year fixed effects, meaning that the effect of the instrument is collinear with the effect, is collinear with the baseline group. So we're capturing, these beta Gs are capturing the differential effect of immigration on Republican identity by groups, second generation and naturalized. The identifying variation is within person changes net of these specific county and state group trends. We predict migration, this C, using, as I said, the shares of Mexican migrants from every Mexican municipality in every US county. We construct these initial shares with information from 2002 to 2006. And we interact this with a predicted emigration from each Mexican municipality in the periods that we study, and normalizes by population, county population in 2010. We do the prediction of this immigration using a Poisson regression with plausibly exogenous push factors. We have municipality fixed effects and as a set of climatic and socioeconomic push factors. So we predict this, and then we recenter the prediction to adjust for non-random exposure to systematic inflows that might be correlated with confounders. We subtract the average of 1,000 re-estimations of our equation 3 with permuted push factors. Our identifying assumptions are that conditional on the set of fixed effects, meaning the county trends and the group trends, immigrant background and US-born white voters, the baseline, would have followed similar partisan trajectories across counties with different intensities of inflows of unauthorized Mexican migration. We think that there's 4 elements that help us in this design. First, the exogeneity of the push factors, right? What's happening at the Mexican municipality level in a different country might be uncorrelated with the evolution of partisan trajectory in the US. Second, we control for county year fixed effects. So again, this is all differential effect relative to the baseline group. 3, we recenter at baseline. And 4, these are person level regressions with a stable sample. Some of the potential threats that we may have and some of the evidence that we have in favor of our design is, okay, well, if these inflows were systematically higher and uncorrelated with confounders, then the recentering at baseline would take care of it. We don't see evidence of pre-trends when we correlate this cumulative shock with pre-period changes in key outcomes. We don't see differential evolution in confounders correlated with the shock, and our effects are robust to controlling for inflows from other countries. So let me go to the results. What we see is that inflows of unauthorized Mexican migration increase Republican registration differentially for the naturalized and the second generation. Importantly, this increase doesn't reflect polarization. You see that the coefficients for the increase in Republican registration almost mirror the decrease on Democratic registration for both groups. There's not much happening on independents, so the growth in Republican come at the expense of a decrease in Democratic registration. There's not a lot of action in turnout. To give you a sense of magnitudes, a 1 standard deviation increase in the instrument corresponds to 21 percentage point increase for the naturalized and 0.3 percentage point for the second generation. As I said, year by year, election by election, Republicans gain about 2% of votes for the naturalized and almost 2% for the second generation. So this effect is a sizable effect. And when we look at the effect over time, we see a graph that is consistent with the graph, the correlational graph that I explained before. We see effects that are higher for 2018, an election, again, in which Democrats did particularly well. Then the effects decreased by 2020, and then they've been increasing consistently ever since, with a high effect for 2024 again. So then we look at different mechanisms. Why would immigrant background voters shift Republican? So we explore 3 different mechanisms. The first might be economic competition. We know from the literature that established migrants are the most direct competitors of newcomers in the labor market. So we ask whether inflows reduce income among immigrant background voters. Now, the measure of income that we have is modeled, so we should take this with a grain of salt. And what we observe is that the effects are quite small and concentrated among the naturalized. A 1 standard deviation increase in the inflows decreases income by around 0.09% for naturalized, and a little bit half of that for the second generation. And this is inconsistent with the effects that we observed before. We see that the response is stronger for the second generation. And here we see that the effects are larger for the naturalized. So we think that this is not really consistent with the story of economic competition. The second might be about cultural proximity, right, and perceived discrimination. We don't have strong priors. We didn't have strong priors starting this project, but there's literature signaling that cultural proximity may either soften anti-immigrant attitudes, again, due to this shared experience and so on, or increase incentive to distance oneself from from newcomers, right? The similar I am to the newcomers, the more similar I am to the newcomers, the more likely I am to distance myself from them because they're experiencing discrimination in the US. So we ask the question, are effects stronger for groups more ethnically similar to newcomers? And here we use the information on ethnicity, and we divide both the second generation and the naturalized between Hispanics and non-Hispanics. And we see that the effects for the naturalized are roughly comparable for other naturalized and naturalized Hispanics. The effects are not very different, but the effects for the second generation are significantly stronger for Hispanics. So ethnic distance seems to matter more for the second generation. Then relatedly, distancing oneself from an immigrant identity may serve as a strategy to reduce exposure to discrimination or social stigma, especially in an area that might be a bit more hostile than others. So we ask whether the effects that we observe are stronger in more hostile areas, by area we mean census tract, and hostile we mean where US-born whites were more Republican at baseline. And what we observe is that there's not much action for the second generation, but there is a stronger effect, consistently stronger effect for the naturalized. So distancing oneself is relevant for the naturalized, and not so much for second generation. And the third channel that we explore is immigration policy. It might be the case that favorable changes in immigration may affect a perception of fairness among older migrants. So if newer migrants have an easier way to come to the US, then me as an older migrant might have a more negative perception of inflows, given that I had a harder time. And for this, we exploit a TPS, Temporary Protected Status, which was the flagship program, immigration program of the Biden administration. And in a nutshell, this program expanded legal protections and work authorization for certain unauthorized migrants. This program had around 400,000 beneficiaries in 2020 and 1.3 million in 2025. So this program really increased by a lot. There's no information at the county level of the number of beneficiaries, so we predict the total number of recipients by allocating the total number of recipients at the state level to counties using networks. And the question that we ask here, the hypothesis is, are effects stronger in more heavily exposed TPS counties? Here we just use 2020 to 2024 because TPS was not in place before. And what we see here, well, first, the confidence intervals are quite wide because we have fewer years, and we're focusing on the counties that were the most exposed nationally to TPS. And we have some suggestive evidence that indeed, at least for the second generation, the perceptions of immigration policy seem to matter more, right? So we think that there might be a notion of fairness here that might be at play. So in conclusion, in this paper, we track the evolution of political behavior of naturalized and second generation Americans with voter registries. We identify the role of exposure to immigration waves. We have two main findings. Descriptively, we observe an increase in Republican registration among immigrant background voters, especially among the naturalized, and causally, we identify that immigration inflows increases Republican registration among the immigrant background relative to US-born white voters, especially for the second generation. We have suggestive evidence in favor of social mechanisms, distancing, discrimination, and perceptions on immigration policy rather than economic mechanisms. Thank you.
Great. We're delighted to have Jacob Brown discuss.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Brown from Boston University. Thank you to Ernesto for the presentation. So I really enjoyed the paper. I think the authors do a really good job with good data to get at something that, as they point out, is really challenging to measure and construct samples where you can make reasonable inferences from it. Sorry. Previous work on this tends to either use aggregate data, lots of ecological challenges there, or survey data where both identifying the samples of interest, naturalized voters, second generation voters is challenging. And then the outcomes we then measure from that have all kinds of challenges. So they get administrative data and clever designs to address identifying these samples. And from this, they get some really interesting descriptive results, as well as some interesting causal results. Gives a lot to talk about. And so I have some ideas for how they can improve the paper, but what I want to focus on first is thinking about their causal estimates, because I think this paper makes an interesting trade-off as currently written between identification and construct validity. So I think what they really want, and when you read the paper, kind of the way they set up the causal test, is they really want kind of an absolute effect on first generation voters, second generation voters. Even if there wasn't a differential effect between white US born whites and these groups and how they respond to undocumented immigration, that would be a very interesting behavioral response that could explain behavior. And I think for identification concerns, there were these county year shocks in this kind of design, despite some robustness they show and how to think about the instrument they use for treatment, that they make this trade-off where they're actually estimating is relative to US born white voters in the exact same county. So a very focused comparison. They estimate a differential response. And so this is interesting, but I think that without knowing more about the absolute effect, it's very hard to interpret what a relative effect can teach us here. Because we can imagine different political stories that could all produce this kind of differential response. You can imagine that naturalized voters are moving Republican, white voters aren't affected, so it's kind of like a zeroed baseline that gives us this differential effect. We can imagine the reverse kind of behavior where naturalized voters are relatively unmoved by exposure to undocumented immigration. And it's really about a democratic effect on US born whites. We can, of course, imagine a little bit of both, divergent moves, or we can imagine they're all moving in the same way, but it's sufficiently different magnitudes to produce this kind of differential effect. Only a few of these stories are a story of a conservatizing effect among the groups that we're interested in here. And so I think the best way I think to provide this paper would be to, one, to just motivate this differential effect a bit more. Why do we care about this? What are exactly the expectations relatively here? But I think even if this is sort of the main causal estimate you want to hang your hat on, you kind of can't escape a desire to know more about the absolute effects to contextualize what a relative effect can really tell us. So I want to talk a bit more about how we might sort of strengthen any identification concerns about an absolute effect to think about how far we might want to push this. I'd be curious for the author's thoughts on this as well. And so the paper does have information on absolute effects. I think they might have concerns with how much of the bias they can get out of those estimates, which is fine. But it does kind of like at least give us some pause for thinking about the general story here. So when they take out the county year fixed effects, move in a group county fixed effect, getting closer to like an absolute effect, they find some pretty interesting things. So at least in this estimation, you're not really finding clear evidence that naturalized voters are moving in response to undocumented immigration. You are seeing this in the second generation group, both in terms of like similarly sized estimates for becoming more Republican, becoming less Democratic. But then perhaps surprisingly for US born whites, there's the strongest effects, at least from this estimation, are a Democratic shift and away from a Republican shift. So any story from this data, I think, has to at least reckon with the idea that there might be this Democratic Party effect in response to undocumented immigration in your sample. And so in thinking about this sort of trade-off you've made, so you have this instrument, this recentered migration flows. You show a lot of robustness. It's really actually more just about the validity of that instrument on its own. And then you make this extra step where you add in these county year fixed effects. So I think maybe rightfully so, you're still worried about the kind of common shocks that happen at the county year level that you'd like to hold constant when making a comparison here. And I think the paper would benefit from just making that a bit more clear. What is it we see in the data? What is it we understand about American elections that makes us, despite overall pretty good diagnostics for your instrument, still worried enough to then make this sort of like informational trade-off where we estimate something not quite exactly what we want? And I think the paper, if it could be organized like this, would be much more clear for me, especially you can sort of show in the ways you check it, like what is it about the check that causes you to reject just a version of this without the relative effect, and sort of take that extra step. And what that made me then think about is that, okay, so you're clearly worried about common county year shocks, but what exactly are the common county year shocks that we wouldn't expect to operate differentially between groups? Because those are still concerning in your estimation. And so I tried to think a bit about this because I think the paper really benefit from like, give me some examples of the things you can account for and the things you're still worried about. And you kind of do this in some of your robustness. But there are probably much more complicated frameworks to think about this. So we can think about national shocks with this pre-existing county exposure that would make different counties more susceptible to them. Some of them might be constant across groups in the same county. Say a house cycle shock that makes everyone a bit poorer in their ability to buy a new home. Or something like a differential occupation shock where the groups you care about are unequally distributed across occupations, they vote with their pocketbooks. And despite sort of your additional modeling decision, this is still something concerning. And so I think just like writing the paper around like these sets of things would help motivate the trade-offs that you end up having to make. There's a couple other concerns I have about the relative exposure on its own. So I worry a bit here, like county is a pretty coarse measure. There's a lot of variation within, especially urban counties. I worry a bit about the extent to which you're picking up on unequal exposure. So we get a sense that, migration flows from cities to counties in your data, but of course people are choosing within that neighborhoods and places where to live. That's going to produce, depending on your model of what residential exposure means, thank you, a different, a sort of a different unequalness in treatment that I think might not be accounted for when we're thinking about. And so the L2 data are incredibly specific. You could do a much more focused geographic comparison to try to hold some of that clear. The last inferential thing I want to talk about here is spillover. So it seems like from your data, you should be able to understand the spatial adjacency structure of all these counties. And you would imagine that if spillover is constant across groups, then no worries, you can handle it. But we also very well might think it's not. If groups are segregated within a county, spillover is coming from one side versus the other. That's not a differential kind of spillover effect that you probably could account for in some way. You might be able to enter some information about the exposure adjacency network as group interactions that might get it somehow. Okay, but at least in my mind, no matter even if you want to sort of tell audiences that the absolute effect can't really be trusted, you still have to kind of talk about it in some way. And so I've been trying to think about the framing here a little bit. One, just to motivate the differential effect, but also how to reconcile that some of the absolute effects you have here. And so I won't belabor this, so you all have written a lot of this literature, but just rewriting the theory section to be as much about why there should be a differential response as there should be an absolute response, I think is important here to think about. And then, this US-born whites result, if we think that's right, is surprising given the literature. It's on average, it's not the modal finding in the literature. There are some exceptions. And so I think you want to talk about what it is about your sample or your test here that's really producing this kind of effect. There's all kinds of reasons why you expect this not to happen. So I try to think of reasons why it might happen based on the literature. And, this could be contact, which is not rather than just exposure. That's going to be really hard to identify in your data. So I'm not sure you can sort of make progress on that. You might imagine that for the white voters in your sample, I assume it's almost entirely driven by California. Those might be some weird whites that you could imagine that there's a thermostatic reaction to sort of increasingly restrictionist policy in, say, urban areas. There is some finding from Denmark where there's this reverse finding in urban municipalities. So that really might be what you're picking up on here. But I think kind of grappling with this is important because you see this kind of results and you worry something more mechanical about the data or inferentially challenging. Okay, so the descriptive results are really great and you organize the paper well. You kind of showed them first and that's awesome. I think they could, especially if you need to step back a bit from what you can claim with the relative effects. I have some ideas for how to even more strengthen what you have here. So right now, you're kind of talking about this as, and I think you show this in the within-person tests, that this is a Republican-Democrat registration trade-off. And people defect, they're defecting sort of across parties rather to independence. I think we should be able to, we can see this, I don't see this descriptively. As far as I could tell, you weren't plotting the share Democrat or share independent in the paper. That would be great to know. We have this rise in California in nonpartisan registration during part of your time series and then a decline in that. And so what is the realignment story here? And then the thing I think would be really cool is, so you mostly focus on in the descriptive results, convincing us there's a within-person realignment going on. That's fine, that's interesting. But you can, with these data, essentially it's an accounting exercise to explain almost entirely where changes in the composition, or in the partition share of these groups is coming from. You can observe people across time, you see how much is due to switching, how much is due to entry and exit into the electorate. You could build this out in more interesting ways. How much of it is young voters entering the electorate? How much of it is churn at older ages? How much this is switching between the various different parties? And then you could even further break it down using demographic information or break any of these factors down into different demographic groups. This kind of structure is like completely doable, the data structure. Vincent and I have done this and other kinds of work. And I think this would sort of bring the descriptive results more to the fore and less as just like a motivation for the later causal tests. So I have some other data questions. They're a little bit more minor. It's of course, what do these 3 states represent? What's this inferred second generation? There's of course be error there. But one thing I'll highlight here that I'm curious about is, so a lot of the construction of your sample relies on these modeled L2 variables, particularly the race and ethnicity things. These are a function of geography and last name. And I'm just like, I had a hard time actually thinking through how that might be a problem here. You're making these very focused geographic comparisons. We could imagine there are counties where these do particularly bad for certain kinds of people. And so I'd be curious in your thoughts on whether this needs to be like constant error across groups within the same place, or whether this might in some way threaten something you're doing here. But thank you very much. I'm happy to chat further, and great paper.
Terrific. Lots of questions. Okay, let's start here and go down.
Thanks. So this is Brian Knight. I just wanted to push a little bit on the economic mechanism. I wanted to suggest a couple of additional tests. One would be using the American Community Survey. You can they record place of birth. They also record where you lived 1 year ago, so you can kind of distinguish between recent versus naturalized immigrants. And of course, they have income. I don't think they have county, but they have something like metro area. And then I think another test that might be interesting to look at, I mean, when I think about economic competition, I would really want to distinguish between the naturalized immigrants who are lower income versus higher income. And so maybe you want to use something like modeled income at baseline and then do a heterogeneity analysis. And then the other kind of separate question I had is thinking about heterogeneity according to kind of like source versus destination. And so, for example, do naturalized Mexicans respond differentially to kind of Mexican arrivals versus, say, arrivals from Venezuela? So I think it'd be interesting to look at some of those heterogeneity issues.
Jeff Frieden. So really interesting stuff. I'm going to follow up on the economics and say that you look solely at the labor market competition component, substitutability, but there's a lot of literature, starting with this classic Hansen, Shivi, Slaughter paper, focusing on fiscal strain, that is congestion in things like local public goods, overcrowding in the schools, use of social policies, social policies, both in the American and in the European context, where with, the Europeans talk about welfare chauvinism, in places like Denmark and the Netherlands. And so it seems to me that if you're thinking about potential economic components of a response, you want to think about these kinds of congestion effects. And I could imagine ways of trying to get a sense of that, county level use of social policies like SNAP and other assistance, what's happening to housing prices, overcrowding in the schools, because as I say, there's a substantial amount of evidence that that's way, especially in places like California, which has a very ample set of social policies. That's the main concern, not only of white voters, but of Hispanic voters as well. Who's next?
Yeah, so I came to Brian's question maybe with a different angle. Since sort of the Republicans are at the right tail, right, that the expansion variance is going to push up the percentage Republican, right, and so any expansion in heterogeneity associated with migrants is going to do this. So that's where the heterogeneity point comes in. And it strikes me that's right, that there are going to be people who are substitutes and people who are complements. You kind of went in with the substitutes first most, but there are people who are going to be like the foreman of a bunch of workers or maybe a small business who are going to really benefit. And so I think that just looking at the variance as well as we're doing what Brian suggests would be helpful.
Hi, Clemens Strickert. So I had, thank you, and I had three questions. The first is to better understand the registration effect. Is it driven by first registration that are more likely to be Republican, or is it about people really switching from one registration to another? And I know you look at turnout, but do you look at the probability to register in the first place? That would be another margin. My second question related to the discussion was also about spatial segregation. So maybe the fact that Hispanic are the most responsive is also because they live in places inside the county where they're more likely to be exposed. And so you could do heterogeneity depending on the extent of segregation within a county. And my third question was about using income to look at the economic channel. If I understand correctly, second generation in your analysis are living with their parents. So they're likely to be younger and entering the labor market. So I don't know to which extent we would expect effect on income if they're not generating that much income at this stage. And so could you do heterogeneity depending on whether they're entering a labor market that is more or less immigrant dominated? I know in the paper you say that second generation immigrants are less likely to work in those domains, but still some do, and they might be the one responding, right? And then the legal stuff makes it worse because they have more work authorization.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Francesco Fasani from the University of Milan. So great presentation, very interesting. So I will reveal my ignorance on this party registration system and ask him what are the incentives to reveal your party affiliation and whether these incentives are different from natives and migrants, and whether I'm just wondering whether migrants have more incentives to comply with the majority and despite what their actually political beliefs are, and think about, if I understand correctly, your results on hostility in the areas. You measure hostility with the share of people voting for Republicans, and you show that migrants then kind of follow that trend. So I'm thinking about basically, yeah, what are the incentives to reveal?
Okay, well, first, thank you, Jacob, very much. This is an excellent discussion. We've been discussing a lot, thinking a lot about whether to center the paper on total effects versus differential effects, and I think this is pretty helpful. We think two things. First, the design is stronger, as you point out, if we center on differential rather to centering on total effects, and also we think that this focusing on differential effects may be better for external validity, right? But because regardless of what's happening on total effects, if we see consistently in states a differential effect, so then we can pretty much predict what's going to happen or what would happen if we had registration for the entire country. We would love to do a more granular study on the effect of the shock at the census block level, but the information that we have from the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs is at the county level. So at least the shock would have to be at the county level. But thank you very much. This is really great. Also decomposing the changes and thinking more about the descriptive part. On Brian and Jeff's points, yes, thank you very much. I actually didn't go over this in detail in the presentation, but these estimates are built on another paper that I have that looks at the aggregate effects, and we precisely study where the effects on expenditure at the local level, what are the aggregate effects on the labor market, and this is also to Andrew's point. We do study what happens with employment in sectors that are more migrant intensive and not as migrant intensive. I think the difference with this paper is that we're really looking at the person level differential effects. So we want to rely as much as possible on this data and not so much on aggregate effects, but this is something that we're exploring as well. Let me see if I'm missing something. Yeah, Clemens, on first registration, we don't really do that because we keep up the sample of consistent voters. So these are voters that we see register the whole time, right? So we don't really study that margin. The effects are consistent if we keep voters that are like a balanced sample, right? Not that are there for 5 of the 6 elections, but the whole time, and the effects are pretty much the same. Let me see. Francesco, yes. That's a great question. My understanding is that there might not be that differential incentives on registering. That pretty much everyone does it with the party, at least in these 3 states. There are states that don't require party registration, that don't record party registration, and so we wouldn't use them anyways. But that's a very interesting question that we should definitely explore. Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. We were more than on time, so we have a longer break until 11:30, so enjoy the conversations. Wow, we've been running a very tight shift here. Yeah, the reality is that everybody went a long time. That's why my timer went off like everybody went much faster.
Now the option would be to say that my minutes. They, I mean, we cannot change the
Yes, yes.
Very funny. Someone must have given a wrong number. I keep getting these, they're very interesting messages. Lady that's on Medicare. And so I get so many of my plans, it's like Medicare now covers Ozempic for 3 months and stuff like that. I'm learning so much. But it's very, I wish I could find this lady to call. It's the wrong number, but I have no way of finding her. Yeah, yeah.
It's not hard.
I don't know, and I never respond. I think it's a great things of paper. Yeah. You know,
But also,
yeah.
we explain like
Very excited about this one actually. I'll get started getting back.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're very excited to hear about securing European borders from Francesco.
Okay. So let me thank I'm Francesco Fasani from the University of Milan, and let me thank the organizer for including my paper in this wonderful program. To preempt your expectation, I'm a labor economist working on migration, and I'm sorry about that. And
nobody's perfect.
And so this is I'm going to present a paper with my longtime friend and co-author Tommaso Frattini. We share the same affiliations. And so this is a paper on European borders, enforcement politics, and externalization. And we have made major revisions, so the paper is a bit of a mess. So I need to apologize with my discussant for sending her a paper which is not really in good shape. And okay, so let me motivate the paper. So it's a paper about Europe. Europe is I quote a paper from Hanson and McIntosh, whose title is the Mediterranean Sea the New Rio Grande, which basically suggests that Europe will be exposed to major migratory pressure mostly from Africa and from the Middle East due to demographic trend and political instability in the area and proximity to all these countries. And so an important component of arrivals, of migration in Europe are irregular, undocumented arrivals, which mix together asylum seekers and who try to reach Europe to claim asylum, and because we don't have well-developed resettlement mechanism as the United States used to have before the current administration, and but also economic migrants come. And so there is a strong emphasis in the debate on border controls. For instance, we just last month came into power the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which is an ambitious attempt to harmonize migration and asylum policy, still to be seen. And the first pillar is securing external borders. And since the so-called refugee crisis that we had in 2015-16 with a massive inflow of refugees, mostly from Syria and Afghanistan, there is a lot of reliance on cooperation with the third countries, such as the surrounding countries, Turkey, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Albania, which is the externalization, which I will talk about a bit. And so what is the European Union? As this has been mentioned yesterday already. So it's a very complex institution which characterized by a persistent tension between the attempt to harmonize policy and the existence of very conflicting national priorities. And the area of migration is a clear example of this tension because it's very salient, it's very politically salient, and because different member states have different exposure to immigrant flows. And therefore they have very different interests in harmonizing. So we have an incomplete harmonization, and so which means that individual member states have still retained control of their national borders and define their own migration and asylum policies. And what about border enforcement? Well, we have an agency which is called Frontex, which is the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, and whose role, which was founded in 2004, and whose role is precisely to try to coordinate and support enforcement at the external EU borders. And clearly, which is part of the paper, so there are conflicting interests. So from the point of view of the European Union, the overarching target is reducing inflows into Europe, but different national governments may have much more localized perspectives. So they care about their borders, whether migrants come into their territory or not, because they respond to voters, of course. And so what we do in this paper, we first document political determinants of EU border enforcement. This is the political economy component of the paper. And we show that we link this to the rotating EU Council presidency, which I will explain, and national elections. Then we use the variation in an instrumental variable strategy to estimate the causal effect of enforcement on route-specific crossings. And then we try to say something about overall deterrence, whether these policies actually manage to discourage migrants from moving to Europe. And then we talk about diversion, okay, whether this enforcement induces people to choose alternative routes. And we talk about the EU-Turkey deal, which I will explain briefly. So contributions of border enforcement is it's an area of public policy which absorbs vast economic resources and receives very little causal evaluation. If I compare it with the literature on police and crime, the comparison is incredible. Okay, so there are very, very few papers. So for the European Union, I mean, we claim, I think legitimately, that we tried for the first time to give a systematic evaluation of EU enforcement policies. And we show the political process that leads to these decisions. And we speak to a much more advanced literature, which is mostly on the US-Mexican border, and which has studied precisely similar questions to ours. In Europe, there are a few papers which came out in the very last years, especially after the refugee crisis, which focus on specific aspects of this broader topic, and on just one route, which is the Central Mediterranean, which is the route which goes from Libya and Tunisia into Malta and Italy. And then we talk a bit about a related literature which has studied the effect of policies on asylum and migration on flows. Okay, what's the research question? The research question is, again, similar to police and crime. Does having more enforcement reduce crossing or not? And the further research, and then clearly there are additional questions, okay, on which kind of roads, on which kind of migrants. And then the further research question is about, does it generate overall deterrence or does it divert people towards alternative roads? And so the paper has a very simple model of route choice where we have multiple source countries attempting to go towards one destination, which is the European Union. There are multiple routes of entry, and these routes of entry differ in the cost, and this cost depends on three variables, which are the level of enforcement, how risky is the route. So sea routes are much more risky than land routes in terms of risk of death, and are even more riskier during winter due to weather conditions, and then depends on distance from source country. Each source country will select a route which is geographically proximate. From this model, we derive the estimating equation, which look like this. So we basically regress crossings, a measure of migrant crossing from source country S through route R in time t on a level of enforcement on that route in time t. And then we have a rich set of fixed effects, which observe route-specific seasonality, all source country shocks, which may push more migrants or may attract more migrants into Europe, and we capture with dyadic fixed effect route and source country, we capture any link, specific link between source country and specific routes. So issues. So how do we measure, which is one of the reasons why this literature is pretty limited, how do you measure migrant crossing? How do you measure enforcement? And so what we do, we take data from Frontex, this European agency, which has data on all crossings which have been detected. And so all migrants who have been detected trying to enter the external borders of the EU territory. These are quarterly data. We follow the period from 2009 to 2015. These are bilateral data, so by country of origin, route of entry, and we have the top 15 nationalities, which account for 92% of crossings, include a very diverse set of countries, both Asian and African, which are both in conflict and non in conflict. So we have a mix of refugees and economic migrants, which we'll exploit in the analysis. And we have 7 entry routes from east to west, which are well, the West African, West Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, Western Balkan, Eastern border. And the graph on the right shows that these were years, this period we studied from 2009 to 2015, and then the EU-Turkey deal in 2016, was a period of a lot of action. So there were the crossing increased, the black line increased up to over 1.5 million, which was pretty extraordinary for Europe, followed by asylum application during the refugee crisis. And then that sudden drop in 2016 was driven by the closure of the Eastern Mediterranean route obtained through the EU-Turkey deal. So we measure crossings, we measure enforcement with the dataset that we assemble on joint operation. And here I need to be very clear. So joint operation means that Frontex involves EU countries in operations, okay? And they so Frontex coordinate the operations and deploys additional officers, but actually the other EU countries contribute with officers, money, vessels, means of transport, drones, whatever is needed to patrol that route. And we assemble an original data set, which is cover the universe of operation. I mean, it's a small universe, 37 land and 52 sea operations, which are all the joint operations which have been deployed over the period of time we study. This data became unavailable after 2015, so we had to stop there. And we built 2 alternative measures, and the budget spent by Frontex on each route in each quarter, and the number of days of active operations which are in each route, in each point of time. Okay, so if there may be multiple operations, there may be overlapping operations, so we try to measure the intensity. We also have a measure of number of operations which has been retired for the moment, but maybe we will bring it back, but I just present 2, which I think is enough. So the period is an increase in enforcement, and both with budget and number of days, and empirical issues that we face, and now I'm getting to the political economy. And so the endogeneity of enforcement, exactly as police and crime, you have more enforcement in areas where you expect to see more migrants coming, and which generated probably a positive correlation between enforcement and crossings, which upward bias the OLS. And so what you need is some exogenous variation. And so we start looking into political economy determinants of enforcement. And here I can rely on the first presentation by Shensi. And so because we try to look into this Frontex. So Frontex does a risk assessment, produce this annual risk analysis, which try to predict where migrants will come. And then they decide on joint operation, and according to risk, available resources, and other considerations. So the decision-making body is a management board. And so the first idea we had, obviously following the idea of the UN Council, Security Council, was really looking for some rotation within the management board. But there was none, because you have an executive director, which was actually a Finnish guy from 2004 to 2015, replaced by a French guy, which, by the way, now is a European member of parliament for Rassemblement National, from the National Rally, or the extreme right party, anyway. And so the executive director doesn't change. You have a representative from each member state, and you have 2 members from the European Commission, so there was no variation in that. But we thought there may we expect countries to push for enforcement toward geographically proximate routes. And we have some evidence from minutes of these meetings, which are, however, heavily redacted, so we can see only some sentences. And the idea would be, okay, maybe some countries manage to have a stronger voice, and maybe Frontex is more willing to accommodate the need of some countries in specific moments, okay? One is when they hold the EU presidency, and the other is when they have incoming general elections. And so what is the EU presidency? Is one of the complicated features of the European Union. So we have something called the Council of the EU, which is different from the EU Council, and just to make things easier. So it's the Council of the EU, but it's one of the main decision-making body responsible for the European budget. What the European countries agreed on is that there is a predetermined 6-month rotation, which is based on alphabetical name order of the names of the countries. So this is predetermined, cannot be changed. Every 6 months, one member country has the presidency. And with the presidency, this country chair all the council meeting and represent the council in the interaction with all other EU bodies. And so there is pretty clear consensus among political scientists that holding the presidency gives a privileged opportunity to shape the EU policy agenda in direction of national interest, okay? And the proof is precisely that this rotation was conceived precisely not to give too much power to a single country. And there is some evidence that this is the case. So if we follow, so the idea is that, okay, we use this rotation, and the idea would be, okay, do we see the routes which are closer? So if Italy gets the EU presidency, possibly Italy is more interested in having more enforcement on the central Mediterranean routes, which brings migrants into Italy. So this is our main IV strategy. So we basically use let me use the graph to explain. We use the linear distance. Okay, this graph shows 3 consecutive presidencies. Ireland, Lithuania, Greece. And these arrows are the departure point of the roads, which we took from the capital city. We play around with different distances. So what happens here is that the idea of the instrument is that each single route, each of the 7 routes, happen to be closer or farther away from the EU presidency due to this variation, which is predetermined. The exclusion restriction is that conditional on the fixed effect we control for, and then we have a lot other regression which we add controls to the specification. There is no direct effect of just holding the presidency on perspective of undocumented immigrant flows. Okay? So we just need to believe that migrants which are in Syria are not saying, oh, wow, now Ireland has the presidency, let's go. And okay, so I'm here to present it. So we have a first stage, which is strongly significant. This negative sign with both measures suggests that basically the farther away you are as a route from the EU president distance, the lower is the budget that is allocated to you. And the magnitude is substantial. So 1 standard deviation increase in distance implies a 1.3 standard deviation reduction in enforcement. We do different things. For instance, we investigate the mechanism, and we show that the first stage is stronger for countries at the external borders, and which are those who care the most about being exposed to migrants. And we also show that the first stage is stronger for Greece relative to Lithuania, which is farther away from any arrival route. We show alternative distance measures. We drop the refugee crisis years, and we show placebo with adjacent routes to show that the IV predicts only the enforcement on that route. And we also show alternative political determinants. Basically, if a route leads to countries which have incoming elections, so if the route leads to countries which have incoming elections, national elections, we find these positive coefficients, which means, again, that there is more enforcement on routes, which leads to countries with incoming election. And the effect is even stronger if these countries with incoming election have a higher share of Eurosceptics, which we measure with Eurobarometer data, and we lag. Okay, so this is these political determinants. I think are nice to show the political economy process, are less good candidates for IV because the timing of election is potentially endogenous to political crisis. The share of Eurosceptics is endogenous to migration, if you want. So we don't use it as a main instrument. Our instrument is a EU presidency. The nice thing is that if you put them together, you have this positive and negative coefficient in the last column, which suggests that you can, so there is more enforcement when there is an incoming election, there is less enforcement if you're farther away from the EU presidency. So this national cycle and EU cycle coexist together in shaping enforcement. Okay, in the final 7 minutes, I present all the rest of the paper. And okay, so we take this and this IV strategy based on EU presidency distance, and we go to address the causal question of does enforcement reduce crossings on the route? And we find this negative coefficient. The size is not, I mean, it's not great. So, and the effect is focused on land routes. So the effect, I mean, the coefficient, if we distinguish sea routes and land routes, we have 3 sea routes and 4 land routes. We find a significant effect on the land routes, and the coefficient is also negative for sea routes, but non-significant, also in reduced form. And then we do lots of things. So we look at the timing. So the timing is contemporaneous, sorry. There is no anticipation effect. There is no persistence. We do an analysis which is, we think is kind of a validation, but also highly policy relevant. We say, okay, are refugees responding more or less to enforcement than economic migrants? And there are good reasons to think that they should respond less because they are fleeing from war. And so there are stronger push factors and they can claim asylum. So being detected as a Syrian citizen by EU border enforcement may be a positive outcome because you can claim asylum and you have a reasonable probability of getting asylum. And it's also, so it's a policy relevant question, it's a sanity check. We have aggregate data, so we distinguish countries as refugees or no-refugees countries based on 3 criteria: the asylum acceptance rate, political terror scale, internally displaced people. And this measure vary over time, also within countries. Syria was not a refugee country before the onset of the civil war. And if we distinguish countries by no refugees and refugees, we see that the effect indeed is on no refugees countries. Okay, so the economic migrants have a much larger negative elasticity to changes in enforcement, no matter what the measure is, acceptance rate, PTS, IDPs, and with both measures of enforcement. And the effect, even if we play around with, we use top 15 countries, if we play around with top 10, top 20, if we vary, we find the same pattern, okay? So the effect is there for economic non-refugee countries, let's say. We do lots of robustness checks, and sorry, let me take a sip. We control for national enforcement, we control for additional determinants of route attractiveness. We show evidence with these alternative IV strategies, which is the national elections, which again, I'm not sure still whether to call it alternative IV strategy, but it's kind of a robustness. And we do many other things to show that our results are robust. And okay, so having done that, we go and try. So what I've showed to you is that basically if you increase enforcement on a route, you do get a reduction in crossings. Okay, and this is again a bit like in the police and crime literature. That's okay, good, but the big question is, okay, are we actually deterring migrants from coming to Europe? Okay, so to do this exercise, our setting, empirical setting, is not enough. So what we do, we extend the model with a participation decision, the choice of migrating or non-migrating, with the right predictions from the model. So we use the model to pin down overall deterrence, and then we need also good estimates of the pool of potential migrants to Europe. Okay, and we take them from, so we take various waves of Gallup World Poll survey, and we estimate which has a question on, are you willing to move to Europe, if you could? And we use that as a measure of potential migrants. We apply our estimates to the distribution of how migrants distribute from different source countries on different roads and routes of entry, and we produce estimates. What we find, and we play around with counterfactual scenarios, we find very modest overall deterrence effects. Okay, still a bit in the making. Then finally, we go into diversion. So the other important question, again, like in police and crime, if you're policing more here, do you get more crime over there? Yeah. And here is the same. So if you're enforcing on this route, do you get migrants crossing on another route? Okay, in our setting, it's not as obvious as because as you have seen, we only have 7 routes of entry in Europe. So these are pretty far away from each other. You have to cross very difficult countries, let's say, like entering Libya, and good luck. And so what we do 2 things. And within our main empirical exercise, we do a kind of IEO, more similar test of route reallocation. So how, if you change enforcement on route R, how does the relative ratio of crossing on other 2 routes changes? And we show evidence compatible with actually diversion. And more close to my heart as an empirical person, we look at the EU-Turkey deal. And here I conclude. And so what was the EU-Turkey deal? So basically, Europe was in the middle of this major refugee crisis, this spiking number of asylum application, more than 1 million, 1.5 million illegal crossings, panic. And then the idea was, okay, we need to close the Eastern Mediterranean route at any cost, which Eastern Mediterranean is the route which goes from Turkey into Greece and then into Europe. And clearly was the route mostly used by Syrians and Afghans, okay, which was the core of the refugee crisis. So the agreement, as any other externalization of migration border enforcement agreement, is money in exchange for stopping migrants. And so the EU paid something like there are different estimates out there, like 1.5 billion to Turkey in exchange for shutting down the Eastern Mediterranean route, which is what happened. So this, the first graph shows the number of crossings before the deal was signed on March, which is the dotted vertical line. So you see crossing peaking in 2015, then dropping due to seasonality, okay, because there are no crossing during winter. And then after March, in previous year, you would see another peak of crossing, but now you see nothing. So basically, crossing almost stopped through the Eastern Mediterranean route. What you see on the Central Mediterranean, you see the same seasonal pattern, crossing dropping during winter and then increasing. Central Mediterranean is again, from Libya into Italy, if you want. And you see that green area. So you see Asian migrants. So Central Mediterranean is only used by African migrants, but then you see Asian migrants appearing, okay? So the empirical exercise we have, which is more visible here, standardized, normalizing the effect. If you look at the Central Mediterranean route, okay, I ran out of time before. And we see basically, if we look at Asian migrants, so the blue line is before the deal, the red line is after the deal. Okay, what we see, let's look at African migrants crossing through the Central Mediterranean routes. Okay, for them, nothing changes. Okay, the pattern of crossings is similar before and after the deal because they are not affected. If you look at Asian migrants, which were not using much the Central Mediterranean route, what you see after the deal, so the red line which goes up, basically there are, after the deal on which closed the Eastern Mediterranean route, the number of Asian migrants crossing through the Central Mediterranean route, so being diverted there, goes out by a factor of 4, almost 4 times as big. Numbers are still, so I should be clear to that. A referee just scolded us on this. So these 2 graphs have a very different scale, okay? And so the zeros there are many more zeros on the Eastern Mediterranean than on the Central Mediterranean. So we find evidence of very short-term diversion. So a few months after the deal, you see Asian appearing on the Central Mediterranean route, but the size is still is not huge. Okay, I'm done. So no, I still have 1 minute. So conclusion, pretty open, because again, the paper is still a bit open. So we provide the first comprehensive and causal analysis of EU border enforcement. We have several key findings which are new. And we show that the EU enforcement reacts to national priorities, both with the EU cycle and the national electoral cycle. We show that it generates moderate route deterrence. We show that this effect is concentrated on land routes and on economic migrants. Based on this estimate, we quantify a limited overall deterrence effect. We find evidence of diversion effects, and which further weaken the deterrence because migrants reallocate. And then we show the externalization of border controls to transit non-democratic countries mostly is effective because you can actually close a route with with sufficient violence, if you want. And but clearly this has high monetary cost, high political cost, high human right cost. So I mean, like just to conclude with a joke, so the thing we say about EU enforcement seems to be that the enforcement decision seems to be more responsive to political cycles than migrant crossings are to enforcement itself. Thanks.
Great. And now we have a discussion by Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me to discuss this great paper. Really enjoying reading it, although it's still in progress, but it was absolutely a pleasure to read it. This is a great paper. It's on a first order policy question. So understanding whether border enforcement actually deters illegal border crossing versus just displacement is a central question to it's a central question to EU migration policy debates, and not just the EU. It's a general question for every country which is as a large border exposed to illegal crossing. But it's a very difficult question to address for at least two reasons. One is measurement. Unauthorized immigration, it's by definition difficult to detect, of course. And enforcement effort, surprisingly, is also not particularly easy to measure. There are no easy available data regularly published by governments on what they are doing when it comes to enforcement, how much money they are investing, and so on. And then you have the endogeneity issue, enforcement response to expected migration pressure. Okay, so this paper does a great job at addressing at least one aspect of measurement. I mean, the detection of illegal border crossing is, it's what it is. The paper is using the standard approach, and there is not much else we can do to measure illegal immigration. But I think it's really making great progress on the other two aspects of measurement. So the first is the data collection on enforcement, and I spent some time on what is great about this, the measurement, and what else could be done to explain a bit better, the measurement issue here. And the other is a very clever design to get around the endogeneity problem, which is exploiting two aspects. One is the exogenous shift in EU member states holding the rotating EU Council presidency, and the other is predetermined geographic exposure to migration routes. Okay, so let me start with the data. So this is really great data collection on EU enforcement operations, and it's exploiting two dimensions here, the budget and hours of operation. But what I would like to know more is how the budget data have been matched to the operation data. So I presume that the budget data that are used in the paper are budget outlays, not appropriation. But given the intricacies of how budgets are decided, it would be, I think, very useful to understand better what's the relationship between budget outlays and appropriations. So let me tell you, say what I'm looking for, which I think would be useful. So these data are relatively high frequency data. They are collected at a quarterly level. However, when we look at spending decision, in particularly appropriation, we know that they are typically done in advance. So I expect that even for this budget, there will be an appropriation for the budget, which is done for the entire fiscal year. But how is, what are the details of the budget? Are these, is the budget allocated to specific functions, say, at the beginning of the year for the entire fiscal cycle, which could be 1 year or even more than 1 year, the budget says this amount of money should be devoted to C enforcement, this one should be devoted to land enforcement. So is this done by function? And then once the actual process kicks in, which is where you would have that the appropriation converts into outlays, what does it happen? Is there flexibility? So based on operational reasons, budget item can be shifted from one operation to the other. So you have a crisis that is entry by land. Can you move the money from sea to land operation or vice versa? And also, is this appropriated budget typically always entirely spent? And is there a possibility to go over budget or not? So if there is a crisis and the budget that has been appropriated previously, is there a mechanism to increase spending beyond appropriated level? So I think describing a little bit better how the budget is appropriated and then how it's spent would help understand how much flexibility really there is in the way the money is spent, and will help understand where this variation that we see at quarterly level is coming from. So the paper is obviously focusing on EU enforcement, but as Francesco explained, these are joint operations. So now I know it's very difficult to get systematic data on national enforcement, so on what are the resources that countries themselves are devoting to enforcement. But it would be useful to get, to have a sense of what is the relative importance of EU versus domestic enforcement. Something, even just what is the share of money that comes from EU, even in aggregate, if there is some discussion, not systematic data, because I understand this is just a bit hopeless that given the way European countries operate, but even if there is some discussions in the EU budget that is pointing at the importance of the EU versus the domestic budget, that would be useful to have. And also it will be useful to understand how we should see this type of enforcement. The money spent by the national governments, at least those that are coming from the EU, should we see them as complement or substitutes? Or maybe they are complements for countries that are right there at the border, but they become substitutes from countries that are more far away from the external border. So it might not be that all member states are so keen in spending their own resources. So it could happen that they substitute for the EU money or not, or the EU has a mechanism to prevent that from happening. So now I'll talk a little bit about identification. So there are two dimensions to this. One is the rotation of the EU presidency, and the other is the geographic exposure. So just a few comments on the geographic exposure. So I think it's simple. It's just the linear distance to the route of entry. But one could think that, well, maybe it would be useful to have some alternative measure that take into account that the cost of crossing can be very different depending on the nature of the territory that you have to cross. So geographic obstacles, pre-existing infrastructure, or if there's a conflict and you cannot cross a certain area and you need to get around. So it would be useful perhaps to have some robustness. Also, when it comes on source of heterogeneity between member states, which is important to justify why they have different interest in pushing for money to be spent or not on certain routes. I think it's intuitive that countries that are right there on the external border have a strong interest in money being spent there. But there are countries that are far away from the borders, but are final destination of those migrants. And so when there were the big refugee crisis, countries like Germany, and at the time, earlier in the years, even the UK, were very vocal about little enforcement being done on the border, because in the end of the day, all these migrants are gonna come to Germany, okay? So I think that there is a more heterogeneity than just border, non-border. So I would think that there are three types of countries, those that are just right there on the border, and they will see all the boats coming. So obviously they are very exposed at the shock. Those that will be the final destination. And then there are the transit countries, which are probably the ones who are least interested. So it could be that countries that are far away from the border but are final destination actually have interests that are more aligned with border countries than with transit countries. So for the other part of the instrument, which is the rotation of the EU presidency, I think it's a very credible instrument. The fact that the rotation is kind of determined by a mechanical rule obviously allows us to rule any sort of self-selection. Countries cannot select in or out of presidency in response to migration shocks. For the exclusion restriction, it will probably be good to have a bit more of a discussion of why the presidency cannot affect crossing only through enforcement. So what I'm thinking of is more that the country holding the presidency, having agenda setting power, may essentially signal something. So possibly, maybe it's not so widely known to the migrant that if Italy has the presidency, they are going to push for more enforcement on that particular route. But perhaps it would be useful to a bit more of a discussion of why we can rule out that this presidency cannot have a direct effect, because it's just increasing the salience of the issue of crossing that border. They're going to watch more that border now because Italy is president, is the presidency. So perhaps one way, I think, your strongest, the strongest part of the paper is to really show that countries do, when they are in the presidency, do affect the budget. So the more we are convinced that really there is this effect on the budget, the stronger the evidence is. And I was wondering whether you could do a little bit more with the data you have. Because in your data, essentially, countries vary in terms of exposures to these routes. But there are some countries that have very similar interests and countries that have very different interests. And what happens when you have the rotation is that when you have a rotation between countries, among countries with very similar interests, you shouldn't see big jump in the budget. Is when the rotation is shifting to a country with very asymmetric interests that you would have this rotation in the budget. So I was wondering, I was looking at the list of the countries, and so one first thing that it would be useful is you have a table where you show the rotating presidency. And I was thinking that, first of all, it would be useful to expand on that table to add just some summary stats that are summarizing, first of all, the exposure, the geographic exposure, and then how much money is spent on the year of that presidency, the amount of operation, so that we can see even just with the descriptive that when you shift from Lithuania to Greece, you already see even just in the descriptive some change. And then perhaps this is just a suggestion, you could do perhaps some more systematic tests using an alternative border switch design, which I will not say should replace your first stage. Your first stage is perfectly fine, but I think it could make the story more convincing. So you already have in one of your robustness check on the first stage, you're already showing that when you have the sequence Lithuania versus Greece is showing the intuition that the rotation to Greece really makes a bit more, generates this bigger jump, not so much with Lithuania. This is suggesting that there should be something more systematic. So if you could just split countries into high exposure and low exposure, and then use the transition from high exposure to low exposure to see whether this is what is generating the jump. So transition from low exposure to low exposure should not make any difference. Transition from high to high should not. But whenever you have transition from high to low and vice versa is where you should see the jump. So one other aspect of the paper, which I found interesting and in a way a little surprising, is the timing of the effect. The effect seems to be entirely contemporaneous. So the increase in enforcement leads to almost immediately to a decrease in irregular border crossing. And I think this probably deserves a bit of an explanation, because why it happens so fast. So one thing that we know is that irregular border crossing relies heavily on intermediaries. So perhaps it's just the intermediaries are very efficient at picking up. They know that now that border is heavily patrolled, and they just switch the migrant to another border. So even just with anecdotal evidence, because obviously this is hard to measure, but I do think that something that is justifying why it happens so quickly would be useful to have there. And then this is my last slide, and I have to do a more political economy slide because this is a political economy conference. So the paper essentially shows that there is some effect. You increase border enforcement, it's reducing illegal border crossing, but it's small. The effect is very small. And so this begs the obvious question of why. So why government are focusing so much on border enforcement when it doesn't seem to be that effective. So there is a political economy argument here, and there is some political economy paper, mainly theoretical. I'm doing some self-advertising here on some theoretical paper that look into the rhetoric of closed borders. That is, government often want to be seen as acting tough, as protecting the border, even if they know that it's not going to do that much. So I think the story of this paper is very much consistent with the political economy story of showing acting tough. We are going to put the wall with Mexico, wall there, and it's common because governments are looking at the electorate and they want to signal something even if they know it's not going to be that effective. Okay.
Okay, let me start from the front of the room and I'll go back.
Thank you very much. Yannis Ioannidis, Tufts University. As an eyewitness of Frontex operations, I have one observation, which is, if I understood correctly, you have 7 categories of crossings. There's a lot of local heterogeneity. So, for example, from Libya to Crete and Libya to Lampedusa, very similar. From Turkey to the Greek islands, there could also be similarities between Africa and Spain, for example. And the enforcement depends very much on this local complexity. I've seen it myself. Second, I wonder about what is in the data regarding the intermediaries, because you see from the press, these desperate people, it's all driven by intermediaries, the irregular migration. And the question is, how much do we know about them? And whether much can be done about it. And I think the discussant had a point about the rapidity with which there is an effect that I think it's tantalizing. Thank you.
Marco Tabellini, Harvard. Francesca, fantastic paper. I have 2 comments which are kind of related to what Cecilia was also saying. The first is, if I think of like a country like Italy, rhetorically it may be, which is of course like immediately affected in the sense that the migrants cross there, but then the incentives are actually, I don't want to catch the migrants because I want the migrants to arrive in Germany. I don't want them, if I catch the migrants, then I'm forced to take care of them. And so I wonder whether one of the reasons why you don't see a very large effect is because some of these countries actually have incentives not to report the crossings. So this is one thought I had. And more broadly, how do we think about the complementarity in the decision of enforce a border? Because if a border gets enforced more, then the migrant flows get rerouted somewhere else, and there's basically a network game at that point, and I don't know whether that creates issues from an identification standpoint. And the second question is whether you can exploit, maybe you don't have enough variation, but I was wondering whether you can exploit push shocks with the timing of your rotation. So imagine there's a crisis in Syria when one route is available vis-a-vis another one. Can you combine this push-pull, quote unquote, strategy to get in the, I was thinking about it in the last part of the paper where you talk about like what are the incentives of the migrants themselves. And if I know that that route is much more costly, I'm not going to follow that. So I was wondering whether you have data for that.
Thank you. Very interesting. Rafael Jimenez from Bocconi University. I was wondering, in terms of the exclusion restriction, if you can say more about where the extra budget comes from. So if they're removing money away, for example, from job inclusion programs for refugees, etc. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just 2 points. I mean, I don't know too much about Frontex, but I know in the context of the US, there's 2 things that seem important here. One is that multiple migrations, like retrying, is a really important phenomenon, and I gather Frontex double counts those. But Frontex is not going to see people who don't get caught and who don't when they get to their further place. And therefore, more enforcement might mean more catching people. Now you're finding a small effect, but that partly could reflect it, that they're catching more people.
Yeah, Felipe Campante, Johns Hopkins, really interesting paper. I'm thinking also in terms of the kind of understanding the relatively mild effects and thinking about like what your instrument is doing here, maybe like, so what you're exploiting is sort of the political enforcement, if you will, right? The variation that you're here, so it's like those extra resources that are being driven by political motivation. So maybe one thing you might be picking up, at least as a suggested interpretation, is that those euros might not be as effective, but that need not be the case for kind of other factors that might be driving enforcement. But it's an interesting result nonetheless, but I think just thinking about what the instrument is doing, I think would be important.
I just wanted to follow up on, if I understood correctly, the land, Stelios Michalopoulos, the land routes interventions are more effective than the sea routes interventions. But then I'm a bit puzzled. Entry into Europe, it is not the northerners that want to come into Europe from Central Asia. It's mostly through Greece, Spain, and Italy. So the bulk of the migration or immigrants or refugees are coming from sea routes. Now, why the results, why the enforcement is so, your data reveal that it's not very effective, is that it is virtually impossible to police the sea. The sea, if you want to really police the sea, you would need trillions of vessels to actually, make a fence. So there's nothing surprising here in the sense that you told us it's like 32 interventions or like countably few interventions, which means that there's nothing there. It's just in the news. In reality, how you can, it's kind of impossible to police, thousands of square miles of open seas, basically. It's, the technology. And there's a change that happens at some point in the European Union that I was surprised that you did not mention it, is that in the beginning, most of those landing in Europe, they could select into where to seek asylum. So they would walk and say, I want to become an asylum seeker in Germany or in other parts. At some point, you have, wherever you land, your first contact, it has to be the place where you will seek asylum. And so this is a massive change because this is where basically the EU will start creating all these immigrant centers in Lampedusa, in basically islands in Greece that Yanis was talking about. So this seems to be much more effective into giving the signal that you can no longer go to Germany and then you are stranded in Greece for like months and months. So that it has to come clear as this is the biggest enforcement. Enforcing vessels in the sea is futile. Your data show it. It's 32 interventions. It's just like kind of hand waving, but it's technologically infeasible.
Saad Gulzar. Apologies for maybe a slightly unfair criticism, but I'm from Pakistan, as a country which is sending a lot of the migrants. For me, we often in these kinds of immigration papers use language that is consistent with sort of a little bit of a panic. But if you look at how short the EU is in terms of the replacement rate for births. That's about 2 million children every year. And in the highest year, it's like 1 million refugees coming into EU. So in terms of proportions, from my perspective, it's not really that big of a problem. The number of immigrants are not the issue. Perhaps the PE around, how to sell that policy is the issue. So I think just in terms of pitching the project, it's important to contextualize what the real issue is, not necessarily the number of immigrants. But more specifically, I think I'd like to hear a bit more about the data generating process. It seems like Frontex is the organization that's generating the data, receiving the money, and also affecting many of the decisions, perhaps. So how incentivized are they to show progress in the years they receive more money? What is the role of presidency of the local country, let's say Greece, when they're in the presidency, and how they coordinate with Frontex? It's not clear to me, like there are New York Times, for example, reports which suggest that, they manipulate the data production process. They certainly manipulate when they send their frontline operations to rescue, for example, people from sea. So, we need to hear a bit more about whether the data production process is correlated with some of the treatments that you're analyzing. And related to that, actually, I think one important outcome that you perhaps have not analyzed is how many immigrants are dying as a result of enforcement. There are multiple cases of hundreds of immigrants dying from single boats being capsized because of specific types of enforcement decisions that Frontex is taking. So I think an evaluation of enforcement is incomplete without also taking stock of the human toll besides, like just from the EU's perspective, what's happening.
Julia from Zenfi. A question I have is related to whether there is also space for collusion in the sea, especially in countries where there is organized crime active, as south of Italy, and there are incentives of people to bring migrants in and work, basically, and keep them there to work unauthorized. And I'm wondering whether this could also explain why you don't find a lot of effects, or you find this time like a very fast reaction that might be explained by the fact that like who is patrolling the sea is colluded with somebody in the country that is waiting for these people to arrive, basically.
Oh, great question. Are there any comments on Zoom? Please speak up now. All right. Francesco, do you want to respond?
Yeah. So thank you. First of all, to my discussant, to Cecilia, for the great comments, and to all your questions and comments. I have 3 pages for, I don't know what to do, but okay, let me try to tackle. Okay, so there were questions on budget, so how do we measure enforcement? So measurement. I put together different comments. So indeed, we measure detected crossing, and so so this is a point made in a paper, AR paper by Hanson and Sprinbergo. So yeah, the detection effect tends to lead to underestimate the actual effect on crossings. Okay? Because if you increase enforcement, you increase detection, and what's the effect on the underlying flows, you don't know. In our case, we find a negative effect, which suggests that there is a reduction in underlying flows, but indeed, this estimate could be is probably attenuated by detection bias, absolutely. And which we discussed it in the paper. And indeed, I mean, we need to be even more cautious on quantifying, even if the whole paper is about quantifying the effect, but then these estimates actually rely on a number of issues of measurement, including, so on the budget. So let me be open. So Frontex started in 2004 with a budget of 3 million euros, which I think is less than organizing this conference. And the budget today is in the range of 900 million. Okay, if you compare with which is sizable, if you compare with the U.S. budget for border enforcement, it's still peanuts. So actually, most of the money comes from member countries. So this is the operational money that Frontex uses. But then it involves member countries who actually put the officers, vessels, and all the expenses. So our measure of budget is, first of all, we know how much Frontex spent on each operation at the end of it. And then if the operation lasted for 2 quarters, we split equally over the quarters. We don't know exactly how much they spent in each quarter. With the days, we are more precise because we know exactly when the operation started and when it ended. And so it's a measure, are 2 proxies of intensity of the enforcement. Certainly, the budget spent on this operation is much larger. On national enforcement, indeed, we don't have a measure because each European country has its own police forces, and there are to the best of my knowledge, none of the European country has a dedicated immigration police. So most countries have a Coast Guard police, for instance, which still the budget is spent on immigration, on drug, on smuggling, and so there is no single budget spent on migration. So we couldn't. I mean, there are estimates out there on how much is spent, which suggest that Europe is spending more on border enforcement and restrictive policies than on integration policies, which I think is true, but these numbers are really approximate, let's say, to say the least. And so very interesting. I mean, I'm picking on Cecilia's comments on the IV. So we play around with different measures of distance from the EU presidency. We have this very simple linear distance because the point is, keep in mind that this is not the distance that migrants have to cross. So it's not that migrants are going to the EU presidency. It's just a measure of proximity of the current EU presidency country with different routes, reflecting their political interest in protecting these routes. That's why we use this very linear, but then we play around with distance, log distance, and distance from capital, from border, and so that's the what we do. And I would think more about the border switch design and think. I mean, we have this example. We show the clearly countries at the border. The first stage is clearly stronger, and we have this example with Greece and Lithuania, I think. And but we could possibly do more on that. Okay, I will. So the overall, I mean, also picking up on so why is the factor is contemporaneous? I mean, here because basically when you reduce the presence, I mean, it's similar to police and crime, but different because basically there as well, when you reduce the presence of policemen, crime start increasing again. But the difference is that with crime, you're trying to deter a limited pool of potential criminals, okay, which may receive the message. Here you have an unlimited pool of potential migrants whose information about changes we don't know. We know very little. I mean, the survey evidence about what they know about policies, about changes is suggesting that they know very little. They know very little about the risk of death and all that. And so I think it makes sense that the effect vanish as soon as you relax enforcement. The role of intermediaries, which has been suggested by you and you, is certainly there. I have nothing to say. I mean, in this paper, we have very little to say with the data we have. Also, on the granularity you were suggesting, is indeed within each route, there are different sub-routes, if you want, and we have no data on that. So I have a parallel project where we map the Mediterranean Sea at a very granular level, and then we try to use a different operation where we map the area of the operations, and where actually we look at death risk, and which is one of the suggestions which we had it in this paper at the beginning, but we drop it for the moment. And I mean, there were 2 comments on incentives not to report crossing or political economy in reporting data. I mean, this is a possibility, and these data are reported by each single country reports how many migrants were detected, and they attribute nationality, which does not mean that they fingerprinted them. Okay, fingerprinting is the way in which each country, if a migrant is fingerprinted in Italy, then Italy is responsible for dealing with this person. And if it's not fingerprinted, then this person can be identified, but then allowed to leave and move elsewhere. And where the extra budget comes from, I mean, we have like a regression where we showed actually the budget doesn't correlate. So if anything, the budget is slightly increasing over time on our routes. And you don't have a negative correlation. You don't have increasing budget on one route, which comes at the expenses of reduction on others. Again, because the budget of Frontex is a tiny fraction. So what Frontex does is basically where we think that Frontex has the possibility of changing this operation is by extending them, prolonging them, or terminating them. And but then still the core of the money comes from the member countries who participate into them. And yeah, we have, again, possible reasons why the effect is smaller, because we have an IV regression is a late effect. And so there may be heterogeneous return to enforcement. And clearly we're identifying the effect of routes whose enforcement is increased due to 0 minutes. Okay, okay, so I'm done. And I agree with comments on the sea routes and also the importance of thinking about death rates and human rights. I fully agree, but it's not in this paper. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, for the thanks for the great morning. Enjoy lunch, and we'll see you at 1:30.
Thank you. Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how you found it, but still.
I'm not sure what I'm saying. Yeah, 45 minutes. Yes. Okay, great. It would be great. It's gonna be great. See, or get a couple.
Which one was it?
Yeah. See you in a. What? But then when I do the links, it work. Okay, then everything is should be fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna download it on so it stays.
Right. Yeah, it worked. Good. I go for lunch. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yes.